Welcome, Andrew. I will be very, very brief. My name is Christoph Zuercher. I'm a professor at the Graduate School for Public and International Affairs. And what we thought, what we do today for the book launch of Andrew's book is Andrew will introduce the book, and then we have a conversation. I'll ask some question, and then we open up the floor for questions. We don't have a moderator. We just do it like a, an informal conversation, like a book talk in front of a chimney fire. That's the plan. And with that, Andrew, you have the floor.
Okay, so if you saw the announcement, then you know that I'm currently an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and senior researcher at the University of Toronto Ethnography Lab. If you're interested in a broader definition of my research interests and activities, you can visit my personal website, www.andrewgilbert.com. It's always hard for me to say that URL out loud. It sounds so self-important, but what other URL would I have, I suppose? In any case, thank you really much for the opportunity to discuss my book today. Although I'm an anthropologist by temperament and by training, as I say in the book itself, this book was really written for students and scholars of international intervention, not necessarily area studies specialists or even anthropologists per se, but really the people that are interested in international intervention and the manifold questions that intervention raises. Just the kind of community that I see is gathered here at CIPS. And so I'm really delighted and want to thank Larissa Kurtovic and Anna Bogic for helping make this possible, and to Christoph for being our discussant or my interlocutor in the discussion of the book. So as he just mentioned, I'm not going to spend a whole long time talking about the book. I'll touch upon a few things and then let the rest of the kind of what the book is about come out through discussion with Christoph. But I did want to give a little bit of an origin story to the book because I think it's important. The origins go way back. It's going to date me a little bit to when I was doing a master's degree at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And at that time, in a lot of my courses, the war in Bosnia, the Dayton Agreement that brought the war to a close, and the international intervention that supervised the Dayton Agreement were kind of being hotly debated and discussed. There was a widespread feeling that saw post-war Bosnia as a kind of laboratory where the institutions of the international community would have the widest latitude to transform the formerly socialist and then conflict-ridden country in ways that reflected the emerging post-Cold War norms of liberal peace, democracy, and an economy organized around capitalist market principles. And I remember back then wondering what all of these grand plans would actually look like on the ground, perhaps skeptical about the confidence with which such far-reaching transformations were being discussed, transformations that would be simultaneously political, social, cultural, historical, and so on. And for me at the time, it became clear that only an anthropological and an ethnographic approach would accommodate my skepticism, but also satisfy my curiosity. So when I finally got to Bosnia, by now in an anthropology program at the University of Chicago, I sought out sites or places where international intervention could actually be observed, where there were regular interactions between those called internationals and those called locals. And at the time, that was the refugee return process, the ambitious attempt to make possible the return of refugees and displaced persons to their pre-war homes. And the international community was particularly interested in so-called minority return, that is, the return of refugees to areas in which they would be an ethnic minority. Not only was this seen as a way to undermine the power of nationalists and undo some of the effects of the war and the tactics of so-called ethnic cleansing, but eventually refugee return became seen as a vehicle for broader goals of political transformation. Refugee return thus drew in every possible international institution, from dozens of foreign aid organizations and individual embassy staff to the multiple organizations of the UN, the OSCE, NATO peacekeepers, And they were involved in everything from police reform, offering legal aid, resolving disputes, rebuilding houses and other basic infrastructure, all in the name of return. And this effort also included a Bosnia-specific institution some of you might know of called the Office of the High Representative, which wielded extraordinary powers and exercised them to support refugee return. This included imposing property legislation, changing the constitution, and removing elected and appointed officials from office. And what I saw in my field work, right, which looked kind of across these different sites, was far more complex than what was being discussed in most of the scholarship. And this is what I worked to capture in the book, what I call, quote, the open-ended, innovative, and unpredictable nature of international intervention that is usually omitted from the ordered representations of the technocratic vision and the confident assertion of many critiques. So as I argue in the book, this open-ended, innovative, and unpredictable nature of international intervention is clearest when you analyze what I call intervention encounters. As I argue in the book, intervention encounters are sites of social and cultural production, where social roles and responsibilities are defined and demarcated, where obligations are cultivated, where responsibilities are distributed, where political logics are innovated, and the nature of authority is contested, right? So these are rich sites for research and for understanding international intervention. Now, for the purposes of the book, I define intervention encounters as those engagements across difference and inequality that are set in motion by policies and projects that aim to accomplish some goal of post-war transformation. These goals might be democratization, state building, conflict resolution, or remixing the population via refugee return. Intervention encounters need not solely be between those categorized as foreign and those categorized as domestic, although they often are. Intervention encounters also need not be face-to-face. They might take place in the public sphere through mass news media, as I document in 2 of the chapters of the book, or between people in more direct face-to-face interactions, as I discuss in chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the book. So if intervention encounters are engagements or interactions across inequality and across difference, one of the tasks of analyzing those encounters is to sort out and account for those forms and relations of difference and inequality. So as I demonstrate throughout the book, considerable effort is spent by Bosnians and non-Bosnians alike in trying to structure relationships by defining the categories of difference among various actors. For example, one very common category of difference was international and local. Another one would be something like Serb or Bosniak or Croat. Yet another would be rural or urban, right? And so people would attempt to define those and then use those categorical distinctions to justify particular actions or compel others towards particular goals. For example, if you could successfully define what an international was and then successfully slot somebody as an international, you could then make claims about how such a person ought to act or what kinds of responsibilities or authority such a person has. This book argues that these efforts at defining and categorizing difference and inequality and their often unpredictable effects become visible only if we focus on the encounters in which they occur. But the focus on intervention encounters promises to do more than just demonstrate unpredictability in engagements between foreign officials and the targets of their intervention. It also identifies key instabilities that emerge out of such engagements and demonstrates how the politics and the effects of international intervention are produced at the very moment that different actors seek to manage those instabilities in their favor. Such instabilities and their management are often animated by questions of legitimacy, and hence the title of the book. Now, it still remains surprising to me that for many years, the designers and practitioners of international interventions did not concern themselves with the question of legitimacy, and neither did most of those who were studying them. When that began to change, most analyses were often limited to thinking about legitimacy in relationship to institutions. This was either the institutions who were doing the intervention, such as the UN, or those institutions that were being built by foreign intervention agents. Other scholars, particularly those focused on international peace building, seized on the issue of legitimacy in part because it allowed them to refocus attention away from the interveners and onto the targets of intervention. That is a way to argue that we need to take local perspectives and agency into account. But my book does something a little bit different than both of those things. It shifts the lens from institutional legitimacy and local agency to focus on the instabilities that the questions of legitimacy introduce into the intervention encounters themselves. And therefore, I view the issue of legitimacy ethnographically, that is, in a fine-grained empirical way, seeing it as part of the everyday life of international intervention, right? That it comes up all the time and constantly. And such an approach makes sense if we just think about common definitions of what legitimacy actually means, as that which is considered to be right or justified or valid. We might think of it as the state or quality of being in accord with established rules or principles or standards. And if we take that as our basic definition, then we can see that those are general concerns in a wide variety of social interactions, regardless of the broader context. And as I argue, we should not be surprised to find that the legitimacy or validity of any claim in intervention encounters could be and probably was contested, and that this constituted a concern that foreign officials had to regularly grapple with. For example, here are some of the questions of legitimacy that I came across and discuss in the book. How could the international community's high representative legitimately claim to be building an independent democratic state in Bosnia when the very means at his disposal violated the principles of democracy and state sovereignty, when he was promoting democratic ends through undemocratic means? How could foreigners largely ignorant of Bosnian language and history and culture come to feel that their actions to secure and transform Bosnia were legitimate and valid when their Bosnian interlocutors repeatedly criticized those actions? How could an aid worker claim to be non-political and thus legitimately humanitarian under circumstances that were highly politicized? And on what grounds and through what practices were those claims to legitimacy contested or accepted by a range of Bosnians? Such questions of legitimacy introduced then instabilities into intervention encounters. And I found that responding to and managing those instabilities were almost always performative acts. And that gets to another kind of aspect or element of how I think about intervention encounters within the broader context of intervention itself. So what do I mean by performative acts? I mean that the mere claim to be building democracy or acting as a humanitarian or occupying a neutral position, claims that I regularly came across in my research, that those mere claims are not enough to be recognized as such. Instead, such claims require evidence, which must be submitted to a range of people for scrutiny and evaluation. In the book, I show how making such basic claims as occupying a neutral position, right? I'm neutral vis-a-vis whatever the situation is, that claim can bestow ongoing requirements for foreign officials to constantly demonstrate this neutrality, both to fellow officials and to Bosnians. I also show how their ability to demonstrate neutrality was a condition of possibility for fulfilling their roles and realizing a range of intervention goals. And this was a source of instability in intervention encounters, because their ability to convincingly and thus legitimately enact or demonstrate neutrality depended upon things they could not always anticipate, such as the cultural norms which Bosnians use to evaluate their enactments of neutrality, as well as actions taken elsewhere and beyond their control. Thus, what we find through a focus on intervention encounters is that a significant part of international intervention is made up of highly performative practices of persuasion, often in response to concerns about the legitimacy of international actions, roles, and claims. Now that's a lot of abstract language and discussion, but some of the basics of the book's approach are out there, right? First, a focus on encounters. One, how difference and inequality gets defined and mobilized in those interactions, and on some instabilities introduced by the question of legitimacy. Now, let me briefly describe the various chapters to help give a sense of the content of the book, and then we can let the rest of the book's details come out in discussion between Christoph and myself. So after the introductory chapters, the book is split into two sections. The first two analyze intervention encounters in the mass news media, something I think is still a relatively underdeveloped or unstudied site of intervention. Chapter 1 shows how foreign officials like the international community's high representative, as well as a range of Bosnian political elites, use the mass media to legitimize and authorize their own state-building actions and attempt to delegitimize those of their opponents. The chapter identifies political innovations, such as a recombinant approach to democratization, as well as important limits to international intervention, something that we may end up talking about later. Chapter 2 analyzes encounters with history, showing how foreigners often had to pursue their goals by using cultural forms and historical materials not of their choosing. So one example of this that I found, although I don't write about it very much, but it's a good illustration, was how international aid organizations took the name of an existing form of association in Bosnia called the Zadruga, and they tried to use it as a vehicle for their anti-poverty development projects. But such materials, such terms, such forms of association carry traces of their former contexts, and they thus resist attempts to redefine them more narrowly for intervention purposes. And so in the book, in chapter 2, I concentrate on a different case, which is how the High Representative took a key Bosnian political concept out of one historical or institutional context and sought to repurpose it to legitimize foreign state building in another, a process called recontextualization. And I show how he did manage through that to alter the Bosnian social and political landscape, but just not in the ways he had hoped for. So here again, another limit on international intervention. The second section comprises 3 chapters which analyze intervention encounters in the refugee return process. Chapter 3 describes how ideas about ethnic identity functioned as an important heuristic, helping foreigners to navigate a social and political field most knew nothing about. Such ideas about ethnic identity also served to legitimize a role for the international community in post-war Bosnia as a kind of neutral mediator between antagonistic ethnic groups. The analysis details how these ideas and roles influenced how returnees engaged foreigners and tried to enlist them to serve their goals. And so in addition to describing an interactional field kind of underwritten by ideologies about ethnicity, I also discuss the instabilities created by relying upon that. Chapter 4 deals with one of the most significant undertakings in post-war Bosnia, which was the massive housing reconstruction projects run by international aid organizations as part of their efforts to support refugee return. Now, alongside the usual technical tasks of those projects, aid workers also spent considerable time and effort in their encounters with refugees, creating the social and cultural conditions conducive to humanitarian action, a process I call humanitarianization, right? So they created kind of relationships and attempted to define those relationships in the context in such a way that they would be seen as legitimately humanitarian. And so chapter 4 analyzes those efforts and demonstrates that the humanitarian status of such aid projects was never more than provisionally settled. It could become, and often was, unsettled. And I argue that that unstable provisional nature of humanitarian action forms an underexplored dynamic shaping and limiting aid interventions both in Bosnia and beyond. And finally, in chapter 5, I explore the role played by an understudied and almost banal seeming, but yet widespread practice of international intervention, and that is the kind of daily production and circulation of English language texts. Here I show how these practices helped foreigners to manage the uncertainty created by a common conundrum. On the one hand, most were led to believe they did not need to know anything about Bosnia in order to transform it. And yet often their experience told them the opposite story, that their ability to fulfill their roles was limited precisely by their lack of this knowledge. And so the production and circulation of English language texts stabilized foreign knowledge about Bosnian politics and society by rendering it in terms that foreigners could understand. And it was that knowledge that became the basis for intervention projects of various kinds. But I show in the chapter that the reliance on these text-producing practices also created some uncertainties or problems. The very practices designed to decrease uncertainty for foreign officials actually increased uncertainty for Bosnian returnees, and this limited the ability of those officials to fulfill their mandate to combat human rights violations and promote refugee return. Okay, that is plenty for me, and hopefully the keywords and the contours of the book are now on the table, and I look forward to discussing things more about the book in conversation with Christoph, and then later Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. First of all, a little housekeeping. We do have a chat, and you can post your questions, and we will monitor the chat, and then Andrew can also react to your questions. With that out of the way, first I want to say, Andrew, I want to congratulate you on that book. I do think it is a really important one. It's a fascinating one. It's also a radical one. I do believe it's a radical book. And I think what makes it radical is, you have your approach which is 100% ethnographical. You go full in on ethnographical, which I find fascinating. You also, in your introductory remarks, you said a few things why you did that, and one word which sticks with me is skepticism. You wanted to see for yourself on the ground what's going on with the big plan. So that may explain why you choose this radical ethnographical approach. But I want to ask you a little bit more about that. So, you go in there, you are the radical anthropologist on the ground, you zoom in on a small microcosmos of interventions, which is encounters, right? So what is to be gained from that, but maybe also what is left out by such an approach?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're absolutely right that to some degree, as a budding anthropologist in a relatively traditional department, going all in ethnographically was kind of the expected route. That being said, I do think it's worth thinking about what the value of the ethnographic is. And of course, partly I've already alluded to it by talking about how certain kinds of instabilities or arenas of interaction or kind of questions only become visible if you are kind of present to observe them. And the other thing is, there is also, very obviously there's some empirical value in doing this, right? That most studies of intervention that employ, even those that employ field work-based methods. So I'm not the only one to do field work or ethnographic field work, although it really is the kind of the main method. But even those others that employ fieldwork-based methods, they often offer very little sense of the unfolding real-time interactions that constituted, international intervention. When like the rubber hits the road. And that's partly what I wanted to try and capture. And so, as Christoph, in the book, there are numerous scenes where we are observing, and I'm trying to unpack these interactions and what some of their effects are. And that strikes me as something that is relatively rare in the literature, and therefore it has, of course, some empirical value to it. And like I said, it reveals things that otherwise would not be revealed. But I have to kind of think about ethnography in relationship to some basic kind of principles of anthropology. And one of those is kind of a basic approach is a skepticism of received categories, right? That this comes from, disciplinary histories that said, we can't bring our own presuppositions when we are going to do research on societies, cultures that are very different from our own, right? We have to be skeptical about our own categories and learn those that matter to the people we're studying. And I think that's built into anthropology in general. And so the ethnographic approach then is the kind of result of that skepticism, which says, I need to learn through actual usage, through interactions, through actions, which categories matter, and also how they get defined and deployed. And so again, that's another kind of value of the ethnographic. I would also say that, well, there's other things I could say, but I don't want to take up too much time, but it is interesting also to think about the limits, right? So I know you wanted to, speak about that.
Yeah,
and
maybe if I can jump in here quickly.
Yeah.
And I told you that many of my very close friends are social anthropologists. I'm a political scientist, so there's this constant love-hate relationship, but we tease each other, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things we do from a political science perspective is, what we think about anthropologists is when we ask them, okay, so what is the situation in a country? An anthropologist would answer, I have no idea. I can maybe tell you about my village. And then you ask, okay, what's the situation in your village? Then the answer is, I have no idea. I only researched one half of the village. Right. So that's the kind of teasing that and basically maybe my question is a little bit about the limitations. If you go zoom in on the encounters, to what extent can you still then aggregate on the whole situation and make statements about that was the intervention process in Bosnia, and that is what has been working well, and that is what has failed, these broad statements? Or are you refusing these statements?
Well, I definitely think that the caricature, one could also caricature, political scientists who, are interested in empirical studies only insofar as they help to kind of develop general laws of behavior, et cetera. And I don't want to paint a broad brushstroke, but you do bring up a really important question, and that is, ethnography is obviously less suited to answering certain kinds of questions or certain kinds of aims, right? So if what you're trying to do is build a kind of general understanding of how things work across cases, across countries, across time, then the ethnographic approach can help you to some degree, but it's not probably the best, kind of approach, or wouldn't certainly be something you could use by yourself. It also requires a kind of cultural, historical, and linguistic knowledge that is very time-consuming, and that itself might appear limiting if you're not only interested in one place. But I will say that in order for ethnography, a field-based method, to be valuable, it requires contextualization. And that itself requires a kind of research that may not be based on observations and interactions, right? It might require knowledge of history, or exploring statistics, or analyzing legal documents, right? So I think most anthropologists, including myself, and hopefully you see this in the book as well, might look at an interaction, but to contextualize it, we have to point to, things taking place, outside the country or in Sarajevo, even though I'm looking at an interaction that's taking place 300 kilometers from Sarajevo, right? That it is about deciding how to contextualize those individual interactions, and that requires, other kinds of research. And I think nowadays, even in my own research, I never stayed with the micro interaction. It was always that contextualized as part of, some larger set of questions. But one can still do that other research with an ethnographic sensibility, right? So if you think about the analysis that I do of media texts in the first two chapters, right, that is definitely not ethnographic in the classic sense of observing direct interactions, but it is a way of treating media documents with an ethnographic sensibility, looking at how certain kinds of terms are used, deployed, how they point to other conversations to try and see that as part of a larger kind of culture making and politics making practice. So I do think that there is some value. I do think that there's, certain kinds of limits, but there are ways to deal with those limits as well, depending again on what you're interested in. And so in the end, I was interested in trying to account for these things that I was seeing on the ground that I didn't think kind of matched up with a lot of the ways in which intervention was being discussed. And
I think you did that in an absolutely brilliant way. Linking to that, one thing you said in your remarks was, which also sticks with me, that what internationals or the interveners have to do, very often do, is performative acts of persuasion. The typical thinking about interveners, especially in Bosnia, because the intervention was so robust, it was a massive intervention. It was together with Kosovo, the largest we have ever seen, right? So you would think that interveners go in with the resources at the time and the commitment, and the capacity of the locals are just tiny in compared to the capacities of the mighty interveners, right? Mm. But then you read a book and you show that at every encounters, interveners have to use performative act of persuasion, which also means in a way that maybe the power differentials are not as large as we think. Mm. And on the ground, it's a very, very different situation. So could you a little bit elaborate on that power differentials, what we perceive to be the case and what's actually happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So it definitely is true that one of the aims of the book is to complicate how we think about power and how it works. And of course, on the one hand, as you mentioned, the interveners come with massive financial resources and often also military means. And that's a certain kind of power flows from that. Another kind of power that we could think about would be the power of recognition, right? That because any state building project, in order to kind of succeed, requires the recognition of other state actors, right? Mm-hmm. Other states, in order to gain a certain kind of legitimacy. And this is something also that the international community or its representatives often bring, and that is the power of recognition, which of course is also points to inequality. On the other hand, as you point out, I show in the book that those forms of power do not automatically translate into the ability to achieve your goals or aims. And I think it's a differentiated approach, but when we look at the encounters across social difference and cultural difference, we can see that power is not top-down or unidirectional, but rather kind of unpredictable, right? It involves processes of negotiation, resistance, sometimes awkward coming together or misunderstanding. And what those things demonstrate is that meanings, practices, identities, inequalities that come to constitute international intervention are produced through those processes, those interactions, those engagements, rather than as some kind of uniform imposition. Mm-hmm. And although relations of power are unequal, they're also unstable. And so, as you know, in the book, I give an example of how, an aid organization comes with hundreds of thousands of euros at their disposal to build, houses in this one village. And their efforts are thwarted by refugees who have next to nothing, precisely because they're able to challenge the moral self-positioning of the aid workers as humanitarian. And so that kind of points to, some of this power difference. So again, I think it does depend on, if you want to think about it, as you put it in your question earlier to me, who wins in some of these interactions. And of course, it does depend on what the game is. If the game is rebuilding, houses in a particular place in a particular way, then you do find there's a lot of instability in the way that the power works.
I want to ask also a question about ethnicity and the way you treat ethnicity in your book. You have a chapter on ethnicity. which is very tellingly titled Doing Things with Ethnicity, which also signals to the reader that your approach to ethnicity is very much a non-essential approach, right? It's Roger Brubaker, and ethnicity is something that is made and remade in discourse and narratives. But then you also tell all the stories about how solid and thick and robust that ethno-national discourses were. It was everywhere, right? It was everywhere, and there was almost no way to cut through that discourse. Could you elaborate a little bit on that tension?
Yeah, so with that chapter, I really wanted to, as you said, take a non-essentialist approach to this, but also kind of explain how it is that ideas about ethnicity and ethnic difference come to be seen as natural, come to be seen as, so it was often the case that that people, and myself included, when I arrived there, relatively fresh, doing kind of preliminary field work, I was encouraged to believe that if I could just figure out what someone's ethnic identity was, then I would know something kind of key about how they thought, how they acted, how they believed. And people were regularly encouraged to believe this. And so you encountered that kind of encouragement. And then, as I show in the chapter, that influenced then how Bosnians approached foreigners. Knowing that they believed this, they would then position themselves or interact through the lens of ethnic identity and make claims about others in those terms. And so part of what I wanted to do is just show, how is it that those ideas come to be reproduced? But I also wanted to show how they absolutely often fail in certain cases, because of course you can't know what somebody believes or what their position is all the time by slotting them, with some sort of ethnic marker. And in fact, although ethnic identity is often promoted or categorized as something that is whose meaning is unchangeable and essential, in fact, its meaning is non-essential and changing all the time. And so as foreigners then try to base their activities and their actions in Bosnia, on these kinds of ideas about ethnicity, they often fail to find themselves kind of butting up against the ways in which that the basis of that knowledge is actually quite unstable. So yeah, that would kind of really trying to see it as a pragmatics, that it is a way that people act that itself is kind of has its challenges.
Thank you. I just want to remind the audience that you can post questions or comments in the Q&A, and we will very, very, very soon look at that. And you will have the floor then, or we will ask you questions, relay your questions to Andrew. That's the way to go. Maybe one last question from my side before we do that. Just imagine, I don't know, an intervener flying to Bosnia now, or to any other place, right? So an intervener, and the tribe of interveners, they're educated Western people. We all met these people, right? So one of such an intervener flies to a country like that and reads your book on a plane, right? Do you think reading your book on that plane before he or she goes and do the work as an intervener, what would be, does it make us a better intervener? What should be the lessons for someone with such a career? Why should they be reading your book on a plane?
Yeah, so it's I'm glad you asked me this question in some regard, because and I'll try and answer briefly so we can get to some questions if they're there. But it is a question that I do resist in the book, right? Like I don't have a kind of like, lessons learned or kind of moment in the book. And instead I put my emphasis on the need for better accounts for what's happening in the sites and spaces of intervention, right? Mm-hmm. So not to rush or always be looking for what ought to be, but first to get a good account of the way things are. And I think that my book offers useful guidelines on how that could be done. And in the conclusion, I should say that I do offer an example about how you could use some of the approaches in the book to understand things in Afghanistan, right? So I do offer a little case study there. But when it comes to prescriptions, I think we need to proceed with a healthy sense of scholarly and political humility in the face of the complexity and open-ended nature of intervention. And let me just kind of preface one last remark by saying that I don't think we can or ought to live in a world without transnational action that responds to the conditions that provoke interventions in the first place, right? Armed conflict continues, natural and man-made disasters continue, poverty has not gone away. And for those of us living in the countries of the global north, our governments and our societies are already involved through the extraction of natural resources, consumption patterns, arms sales, the influence of market forces, the naturalization and circulation of political and cultural forms, migration policy, right? There is no innocent position and there's no neutral position. So what lessons might I offer? They're not going to be the kind that are prescriptive in a really easy way, but one thing that I think is really crucial, and that is that any intervention that seeks a kind of justice or beneficial effect has to be built upon a relationship that is not so unequal. And in order to achieve that, I think we have to start with the position that greater resources does not equal greater authority, expertise, legitimacy, or moral positioning. So that's one thing. I know that that's often the way these things work, but we have to resist that. The second thing is to foreground the knowledge and experience and history whose lives are at stake, which might mean admitting that you don't have all the answers ahead of time, and be willing perhaps to produce something out of the engagement rather than think you have all the answers coming first, right? That there's no easy solutions, and to create something in common. And we can talk about the feasibility of that or not, might be pie in the sky, but that's kind of where I come out. But let's go to some questions from the audience if they're there.
Yes, I think Larissa has been monitoring the Q&A for us, and Larissa will now introduce the questions.
Yes, thank you, everybody. My apologies for my chaotic entry, it's been lovely to hear you all speak. So the first question, and I think I'll take it one by one, it comes from Gina Vukojevic, so I'll just read it. Thank you, Andrew. Looking forward to digging into the book for my own work. She is one of my students, but she's saying, could you say anything about observations around differences among the types of organizations or interveners beyond the relatively homogenizing categories of international and quote unquote foreigner? Of course, those engaged in intervention, quote unquote, and even those who are foreigners are not the same. And those differences are interesting to trace.
Yeah, so that's a great question. You're absolutely right, of course. You know, I do spend a lot of time in the book because my interlocutors spent a lot of time in the book talking about those key differences. That being said, of course, you know, a lot of time was being spent by, you know, somebody saying, I work for the OSCE. What you're asking me to do is something you should ask you know, this other organization, or I work for the UN, we don't do that, or we're not responsible for that. And then often Bosnians of various kinds saying, you know, poppycock, you know, you're absolutely, this is your responsibility and what you ought to be doing. And so there was absolutely a kind of negotiation often times on not only kind of those key categories of difference, international, local, but then, you know, attempts to differentiate within them that were often the subject of quite heated discussion and with serious consequences. Oftentimes I would see, because I ended up doing most of my research outside of the centers of administrative power in Bosnia, so not in Sarajevo, not in Banja Luka, but in northwestern Bosnia, in the area around two small towns. And there were OSCE officials there who were regularly called upon to answer for actions that other foreigners had done elsewhere, and how they would always try and resist that, sometimes with to better or worse effect, or with better or worse success. So I think you're absolutely right. And of course, oftentimes foreigners would be doing very similar things vis-a-vis the so-called locals. The category that interested me the most, although I didn't end up getting to write about it much in the book, were those so-called locals who were asked to stand in for the international. And then those internationals who tried to style themselves as kind of locals. And the way to which they tried to do that was often fascinating for me. And so, yeah, this is blurry stuff that you can only kind of dig into in the interaction itself to see how it plays out. So thanks for that question. It was a good question.
All right, so the next question, and I do want to invite all the members of the audience to pose questions in the Q&A box. So the next question comes from my colleague Srđan Vučetić, who says, hi, Andrew. And he says he agrees with Christoph that this is a delightful, radical book, and thanks you for launching it here at CIPS. So 2 questions only. So one is, what roles, performative or otherwise, did liberalism play in the intervention encounters you observed, specifically with respect to local/international and ethnic differentiations, and also the Englishization of post-Dayton Bosnia? And he says in the parentheses, and by liberalism, I mean both ideology and social imaginary. So that's the first question. And the second question is, when you look at post-Dayton Bosnia today, what instabilities do you see, and how many of them are the products of international interventions and its problems?
Yeah, I love, Larissa, how you said only 2 questions. Those are huge questions. Could spend a whole session on just talking about those. So, I mean, clearly, liberalism played a role insofar as the model being used to kind of imagine what the post-Bosnian state would look like was a kind of classically liberal one with separations of powers and imagining a robust, civil society and, through a series of associations and a robust independent press and courts, et cetera. So there was this kind of both liberal imaginary, but also a liberal imaginary that also came with this thesis that if you put those things in place and they took, that it would create the conditions for peace, right? So this is often discussed as the liberal peace thesis. So it definitely played a role and informed a lot of what was happening. Although, of course, there were other forms of intervention which I don't really take up in my book that would not have necessarily conformed to that vision. I don't know if it also falls under the question of liberalism, but certainly there was also this idea, and I do talk about it quite a bit in my book, where the modern actually was a category that mattered a lot for the interveners. And so they would often categorize what they were doing, their liberal ideas, as the modern compared to the backwards, anachronistic, rural, communist positions of the Bosnians, and that's that often this came out in frustrations about why people weren't acting the way that they hoped they would. I'm going to have to leave the question of liberalism there to touch on the other thing, instabilities today. So what I think is really interesting, I'm just going to touch on one because it's a huge question, and again we could talk for a long time about it, but that is the question of, as I mentioned before, international recognition, right? So that it still is plays an enormous role in domestic politics, the degree to which certain kinds of outside forces, powers, or actors can be kind of enlisted to support one's position, right? And so right now we're seeing that kind of play out between Milorad Dodik in the Republika Srpska, who is kind of enlisted kind of Russian sponsorship to kind of buttress his position as he kind of carries out a set of actions which are then criticized by other actors in Bosnia, who then try and enlist, let's say, German, US, EU, British kinds of actors to kind of buttress their position. So there really is this way in which the international gets folded into the domestic politics quite often. And I would say for someone like Dodik, he's played this game for a game, shouldn't put it that way, but he's pursued this way of pursuing politics for almost 2 decades now. He's very good at it. And one of the things is it's almost a no-lose situation, because even if he doesn't follow through on certain kinds of separatist actions, he gets the recognition of the foreign West of his authority, right? So he still gets a certain kind of recognition because he forces them in part to kind of reckon with, accommodate, or in some other way kind of deal with him. And so I think this is definitely, if we want to talk about an instability, a legacy of the international intervention, which we see kind of literally playing out right now in Bosnia.
So thank you, Andrew. Right now there aren't any more questions, so I would take can I take an opportunity to pose a few and also respond in part to what you're saying? It's funny, Dorik is in Ankara today, actually, visiting Erdogan of all things. And I think that you're completely right. There's been a lot of chatter in the kind of diaspora and academia trying to make sense of what all of this means. And there's this really humorous website called www.isitwar.yet, where you can go and click and see, will there be a war, as if you would check the status of like the internet connection or something like that. So these are some of the local responses to the chatter that, you know, there might be a kind of a new war. But then again, I don't think that this is like an actual local political crisis as much as it is a geopolitical crisis, right? And I think that, you know, the point that you make is a good one. And, you know, there's a lot that we could say about limits of ethnographic expertise, which you already touched upon. But, and like limits of divination, you know, as a part of kind of knowledge production. But I did want to ask you something a little bit cheeky, which is, you know, there is a way in which, you know, because of the presence of international community, because of certain symbolic sort of dimensions of that intervention. I mean, the very fact that there is something called the Office of High Representative, right? You know, a lot of people, and especially a lot of Bosnians who are critically inclined, have tended to frame the intervention in not so flattering terms, you know, around whether this was a kind of a new form of imperialism, whether Bosnia was now a protectorate. Now people, you know, have differed in their opinions of whether that protectorate was necessary. You do quote, you know, Nezog Turek and, you know, things like that. Or whether it's something that's an impediment, you know, to the future at all, generally speaking. So I want to, you know, and I know that you resist this kind of language of kind of protectorate imperialism, and I want to hear you talk a little bit more about why. What is sort of lost in the performative acts of those types, and what is it that your book perhaps brings to the table that shows another way of thinking through this predicament, if you will? Yeah,
so thanks, Larissa. Yeah, so it's a good question, because I do, if you read through the introduction to my book, I kind of set it up against 2 broad approaches to thinking about international intervention. The first is what I call the success-failure paradigm, and the other one is what I would call a kind of very easy critique of international intervention as colonial or imperial or neo-colonial or neo-imperial. And the reason I do that is because neither approach really is that interested in what's actually happening on the ground, right? So there really is a kind of way in which I think terms like that, at least at some level, and this is to say colonial and imperial, kind of obscure what is happening on the ground. And they're often deployed in ways that are attempts to critique or discredit a particular, you know, action or otherwise. So again, not really interested in understanding how things play out, but more just about discrediting them. So that being said, that was one of the reasons I wanted to kind of resist that. And also because they ended up using kind of a nation state view of the world to talk about their critiques in ways that, again, I didn't think really illuminated what was happening on the ground. Now, that being said, part of the reason I also resist that is because my interlocutors, like you just said, there are those within the country and certainly outside of, but also within the country who label this critique. There's a debate, neo-colonial, imperial, etc. But I do quote this person in the end of my book from research I did in 2016 or 2017. So quite a few years after my original research, where the international presence is not nearly as robust, almost non-existent, but there still is this high representative of the international community. And as is often the case, as I say in the chapter, whenever a foreigner who can communicate with Bosnians, whenever I would meet Bosnians and they could figure out that I could understand and speak with them, then I became the sounding board for every possible kind of complaint and observation about geopolitics. And I'm used to that, and it's a great research tool. But this guy was complaining about the then current high representative and how he didn't do anything. And, he had these powers and he could do these things, but he always says that the Bosnians should do it, but he could so easily, and I was expecting that he was just going to continue complaining about him. But then at one point I said, well, so would you rather he just left? And he said, no, he's our only hope. What we need is more robust intervention, not less, because we Bosnians, he had this kind of theory about how Bosnian political culture wasn't, mature enough for self-government. Now, you can take that however way you wanted, but what was fascinating to me at that time was how the idea of the international, powerful international, who could act if he wanted to and could actually fix things if he wanted to, was still part of the political imaginary in then contemporary Bosnia by someone who was a simple, not a critic who was in the newspapers very often, but just a simple worker who had just been on a hunger strike in the city of Tuzla, and I was doing research on something else. So those are a couple of reasons why I like to kind of resist a little bit some of that kind of critical framing, because I think that it misses a lot of these other, perhaps more complex or maybe even less kind of, palatable kind of responses, at least to the critical imagination, that exist on the ground and that are part of daily kind of politics.
Thank you for that. So there are more questions. The first one comes from Dorian Juric, who you know. Hi, Andrew. I'm reminded of Glyn Cochrane's Festival Elephants and his discussion of how international aid post 1960s saw a dramatic shift away from what could be called an ethnographic approach to a very hands-off administration by unfamiliar outsiders. How much of the form of intervention in Bosnia is a direct product of that, of the exact historical time at which it took place?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, I see that we're kind of at, I think, our time. I'm happy to go on, but if at some point we need to stop, there's no problem. So that's a good question, Dorian. And in the book, I definitely talk about, I don't talk as much about this. So there's other authors that do what you're talking about, that do the work of saying it used to be that, the Foreign Office of the UK was stacked with people who were experts in particular places that were fluent, knew history, culture, and could engage in regular communication, and that was the approach at one time. By the time we hit the 90s, we are at a point where to be an intervener, what you need to be an expert on are all the things that these places don't have. So it's not about your knowledge of a place like Bosnia, it's your knowledge of gender mainstreaming kinds of policies. It's not about your knowledge of the history, politics, and language of a place, but rather your expertise in democratic, elections. And so definitely that played a big role in the intervention in Bosnia, because again, most foreigners landed knowing very little about Bosnia, and they were encouraged to believe that they were there because they were experts in these internationally circulating kind of political forms, and lots of challenges then when they hit the ground and found themselves actually needing some of that local knowledge. And so it's a great question, and it's something I definitely deal with in the book, and a few others have pointed that out as well.
So the next question, and possibly the last one, given our time constraints, comes from Jasna Dragovic-Sosa. So hello, Andrew. I'm looking forward to reading your book, which is on order at the moment. My question concerns the issue of legitimacy, and I suppose what I am understanding from your talk is that legitimacy is asked of, aimed at the local Bosnian level. However, most agencies depend on Western states and donors. So to what extent do you consider the search for international legitimacy, especially in the West?
Yeah, so that's it's a great question. I mean, legitimacy really is, a broad, there's a broad set of concerns that revolve around legitimacy and a lot of different levels and ways you could think about it, right? So I talked a little bit earlier about the kind of legitimacy that foreigners can bestow by recognizing, right? So the power of recognition can bestow legitimacy on certain actors in Bosnia who can kind of deploy their relationships with foreigners for kind of generates local political capital in particular ways. At the same time, the interveners also, and this was the kind of the level at which I was most often talking or thinking about legitimacy, had to made certain claims all the time about why they were doing what they were doing, and that could be questioned as not a legitimate or valid claim. And so they would have to then provide evidence of that claim. And that, so what I kind of ended up looking a lot at were those attempts to kind of stage certain events in ways that would provide evidence for foreign claims to be building an independent state, or that they were actually neutral vis-a-vis certain kinds of ethnically defined conflicts. And so the search for legitimacy and validity was one that kind of cross-cut all sorts of relationships and all sorts of levels. And again, I was kind of more interested in the instabilities that question created in the kind of daily interactions between Bosnians and, in this case, let's say, kind of Bosnians who were refugees or returnees, and the people who were there to kind of mediate their return, the foreigners. But then also I do talk about kind of Petric in an older case study and Bosnian elites and the attempt to kind of frame and reframe what the other was doing in ways that would try and get them to kind of act towards certain kinds of ends. And the question of legitimacy definitely, or the legitimacy of certain kind of framing devices or frameworks was kind of contested and took up a lot of time and effort on the parts of everyone involved. So hopefully that helps. And I'd be delighted to hear more about what you think if when you get the book. So thank you.
So that concludes the question portion. Maybe I can return it to Christoph and to you to wrap it up.
I think, Andrew, you should wrap it up.
Okay, yeah, great. Toss it to me.
Yeah, I will be overwhelmed in wrapping up that discussion. The only thing I say is this. As to my last question to you was imagining that that member of the tribe of the interveners flying to Bosnia and what that member of that tribe could learn from your book. And you gave an answer. My answer would be, I don't think this, I think you rightly resist to give that's what should be done. But I think what can be learned from the book is how we should think about interventions. I think that's valuable. That's why I think as Zuercher said, the book is delightful and radical. So we agree on that. And with that, you have the last words, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say except that I'm just really grateful for this opportunity to talk about the book. It is one of the kind of unfortunate side effects of publishing a book during the pandemic, that a lot of the kind of regular kind of avenues for kind of circulating, discussing books, and also being able to kind of count on attention of your colleagues. These are all things that have become much more complex and complicated. And so I'm just really happy to be able to talk about it, and also with really the community of people for whom I wrote the book. That is to say, the kinds of people at CIPS, and so I really couldn't imagine a better audience with which to talk about the book. So thank you very much. And yeah, the book is available as a hardcover at the moment, or you know, a soft or an e-version of the book. And I also understand that I think the e-version is available through the University of Ottawa library. Although don't let that stop you from getting your own copy if you're interested. All right, thank you very much.